So one of the key statements from Chandogya Upanishad that often comes in Vedantic philosophy is this particular statement called Tat Tvam Asi. Okay. So when you look at it literally, when you say Tat Tvam Asi, Tat means that, Tvam means you, Asi means are. So that you are, that means it is the other side of Aham Brahmasmi. Aham Brahmasmi is first person, whereas Tattvam Asi is second person. So you're saying Aham Brahmasmi, but then you're saying Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. That is a literal meaning of Tattvam Asi. So as I pointed out to you before, is this the literal meaning, all that is there in philosophy of Tattvam Asi, or there is a wider, more expansive philosophical meaning of Tattvam Asi? So that is what I want to focus on today's talk, because for understanding Tattvamasi from a Lakshana Vritti perspective, you need to adopt and you need to introduce the principles of Samanvaya. And that is why it becomes important. And I again come back to this, we should never read Upanishads and Vedas in a very superficial sense. You have to dive deep in so that you get these gems and pearls out. Okay. I also told you about this interesting historical incident that happened in the 13th century, where there were three giants, Akshobhya Tirtha from the Dvaita school, Vidyaranya from Advaita school, and Vedanta Desika from the Visishta Dvaita school. They were all contemporaries and they used to interact with each other quite frequently. And it so happened once they had a debate on this very particular topic of Tattvamasi and what it actually means. And the debate or the discussion, and that is how philosophizing usually happens with debates and disputes. That is verbal philosophical disputes, not hitting each other. So such a philosophical disputation actually happened between Akshobhya Tirtha from the Dvaita school, Vidyaranya from the Advaita school, and the great Vedanta Desika himself was the judge from the Visishta Advaita school. And so Akshobhya and Vidyaranya had this discussion. So what I'm going to do today is, of course, we cannot deal and talk about the various angles and aspects and the levels in which these two great philosophers had their discussions, but I want to give you a flavor as to how that philosophical discussion happens around Tattvamasi, which uses the principles of Samanvaya. So moving on to the next slide, Chitraji. Yeah. So now to understand Lakshana, you need to know the fundamentals of metaphors. What are metaphors and what is the fundamentals? And again, this is universal for all languages. And it is just that our ancient rishis had actually perfected this into an art in its own right, and it was a separate language, as it were. It was an art. So they classified lakshanas into two common lakshanas called Jaha Lakshana and Ajaha Lakshana. Okay. Now, what is Jaha Lakshana? Jaha means Jahati. Jahati means you abandon or you give up the literal meaning, and then you take another meaning. So when I say Benares is a city on Ganges, that when I read it literally, it doesn't make sense. How can Benares be on the Ganges? It has to be in the bank of the river Ganges. So for that understanding, when I say Ganges, what I should do is I should take the literal meaning of Ganges, but I should understand it as it is in the banks of the river Ganges. Yeah. So that is, you're abandoning the literal meaning of Ganges, but instead you're saying banks of the river Ganges. So that is Lakshana Vritti. Now, why do you sometimes put Lakshana Vritti? Why do you say Benares is on the city of Ganges? It is to say that this is a holy city, and and because of the Ganges is there, it is always a very cool place to go. It is very breezy and nice. So to give you those ideas, we use metaphors. We'll come to that later. See, when I say Simho Devadatta, when I say Devadatta is a lion, I don't mean he's literally a lion. I just mean that how brave he is. It is to give you those special qualities that we use this kind of lakshana in our language always. So next time when you have these kind of conversations, just check and be mindful of how many times you actually use your metaphors in your home, in your mother tongue. Whatever you communicate at home, you would be surprised that you're using metaphors on many occasions. So that is Jaha Lakshana. So then you have something called Ajaha Lakshana. Sorry, there is an image of William of Ockham by mistake there. So what is Ajaha Lakshana? Ajaha Lakshana is the opposite of Jaha Lakshana, which means you retain the sense of the word, but you also use other meanings. So when I say the flags are advancing, yes, the Indian flags are advancing. That is correct when I look at that picture. But at the same time, the soldiers are also advancing because the soldiers are actually holding the flag. So in that context, the flags are advancing makes sense. But at the same time, by Lakshana Vritti, we can also understand that the soldiers who are holding the flags are also advancing. Okay. Again, we use this quite a lot in our language. So our Vedic rishis and philosophers classified Lakshana into two, Jaha Lakshana and Ajaha Lakshana, for communication, also of philosophy in the Vedas. Now there is one particular school that also adopts a unique Lakshana called Jaha Ajaha Lakshana, which means you abandon some and retain some. So it's you extract the concepts from both Jahad and Ajah and use it as Jahad Ajaha Lakshana. So this is unique to the Advaita system, which is nowhere heard in any Vedantic philosophy. It is a unique Lakshana that they somehow made it to themselves and they hold on to it. It doesn't have any approval from the Vedic philosophy, but that is called Jahad Ajaha Lakshana. Where, for example, if I say Benares is a city on Ganges, what I would do if I use Jaha Ajaha Lakshana is I would keep some meanings of Benares, I'll abandon some meanings of Benares. I'll keep some meanings of Ganges and I'll abandon another meaning of Ganges. So that is what is called Jaha Ajaha Lakshana. Google it, do some studies about what Jahad Ajaha Lakshana is. It's quite interesting. Now the rules, coming back to it, is these are all the rules. Minimum Lakshana only to get the meaning. So if I want to get a meaning of a sentence, I have to use minimum Lakshanas to get the meaning. That is the rules of grammar and it's the rules of language everywhere in the world. So that is called Occam's razor. Some of you may be familiar with this. So Occam's razor, so this guy, William of Ockham from south of England, came up with this philosophical concept in the 16th century thereabouts. So it is now very widely used both in scientific literature as well as in philosophical literature. What does that mean? It means if two explanations are equally plausible, the simplest explanation is usually the one with the fewest assumptions. Okay, that is called Occam's razor. And of course, William of Ockham, he probably identified this, but our Vedic rishis had actually explained this thousands of years ago, and they used a term for this called Kalpana Laghava and Kalpana Gaurava. Laghava means fewer, Gaurava means more. Kalpana means assumptions. So fewer assumptions is called Kalpana Laghava. More assumptions is called Kalpana Gaurava. So we should always make minimum assumptions to get meaning of a sentence. So that is the fundamentals of metaphors. So unless we understand these fundamental rules of metaphors, we should never even make an attempt to understand Tat Tvam Asi. And that was the reason why I had to give you this background information. Moving on to the next slide. So Samanvaya in practice. So Tat Tvam Asi of Chandogya Upanishad comes in the 6th chapter. Okay, so we said Tat means Brahman, Tvam means Jiva, Asi means you are. So now we have to adopt the rules of Samanvaya. What is the first step? First step, as Ajit mentioned in his introduction, is we have to decide whether this is a concept that talks about material things or non-material things. We all accept that it is talking about a trans-empirical entity, which is a non-material things. Jiva and Brahman are non-material things. So Vedas are the jurisdictions to provide evidence for that. So we accept that, okay, this is a field of the Vedas. Now the next one is important. When you look at a Shruti or when you look at a Vedic sentence, the next step there is you should ask that question: is it a Niravakasha Shruti or is it a Savakasha Shruti? What does that mean? Niravakasha means it has only one meaning. Savakasha means it can have more than one meaning. You may be very familiar in some languages. In Kannada, for example, there is a popular word called Savakasha. Savakasha Utamadi means please eat well, please eat a lot of food, and please eat well. So that Savakasha that is commonly used in, say, language like Kannada actually comes from Sanskrit word where Savakasha means more meanings. So you would be surprised, or probably some of you may be aware, that the Tattvamasi of Chandogya Upanishad has at least 12 different meanings. Okay, not just you or that. It has 12 different meanings. I'll try and highlight a few meanings, and I hope it's provocative and interesting. Now, so now we accept that this is not a Niravakasha Shruti, it is a Savakasha Shruti. So now what we can do is we can use the applications of Tatparya Lingas and Purva Mimamsa Sutra rules that Ajit was mentioning about. And then try and get the meaning of what is it that this Tattvamasi of Chandogya Upanishad has actually set itself to prove. So for that, to understand that, you need to get the context, and that is prakarana or context, which, as you know, is part of the Purva Mimamsa Sutras, is one of the rules. What is the context in which this Tattvamasi is coming from? You should never pluck a word from the Vedas and then put it aside and say, this is the philosophy that I am going to propagate. You need to understand Tattvamasi as it is. The reason being, Tattvamasi has got a history, it has got a background, it has got a context, it has got a set of grammar, it has got a syntax, and it has got a set of etymology and so on. And then you have to use that to understand. Because mind you, Vedic language is like a USB stick. And we discussed this a lot of time. We said Vedas is called Chandas, and it is called Chandas because Chadayanti iti Chandamsi. You have to split, open, combine, and get more and more meanings out of it. It'll be unfortunate if we just take one meaning and then build a big castle around it. No, we need to get more and more meaning around this. So what is the prakarana of Tattvamasi? So I'll read this. These are such beautiful verses in Chandogya Upanishad. So the Upanishad basically starts like this. So Saha Dva Dasha Varsha Upetya Chaturvamsha Shati Varshaha Sarvan Vedan Aditya Mahamana Anuchanamani Stabda Eyaya Tamha Pitovacha. So that is the first second line. So what basically means is this Tattvamasi is a discussion that happens between a father and a son. Father is Uddala Karuni, who's a great philosopher of those times. And his son is Shvetaketu. So this guy, for the first 12 years of his life, was a naughty errand who was just running around, not interested in any studies. And then his father tells him, you're wasting 12 years of your life has gone wasted. So please go and study something. Know about that Brahman. Go and study about Brahman and come. So what happens? Dvadasha Varsha Upetya. So Dvadasha, 12. So he goes to Gurukula for 12 years. Then Chatur Vimsha Shati Varshaha. So that means 24 years. So when he is 24 years, he comes back. So 12 years he goes to Gurukula, he studies for 12 years in the Gurukula, and then he comes back when he is 24 years of age, and then he comes back with so much of arrogance and ego. And the Upanishad describes this very beautifully. It says, Sarvan Vedan Aditya Mahamana Anuchanamani. This fellow came to his father's home with so much arrogance that he has studied all the Vedas. Sarvan Vedan Aditya Mahamana Anuchanamani is an interesting word which means arrogance. Yeah, with full of arrogance, he comes and he says, my father sent me, I have learned everything about the Vedas, I know everything. Why should I bow to him and do namaskara when I come home? So how was he standing? He was saw this guy. Oh Lord. So this guy has gone to study for 12 years. We thought he will study and become humble and express humility, but he has actually come back after his university education with so much ego. And believe me, as an academic in a university setting, I am very, very used to this kind of behavior in my colleagues and in my faculties. The arrogance and egos that people exhibit because they know something. It's very common to see in universities. When you roam around universities, every time I see a Stabda AI, I remember Shvetaketu because there are lots of these kind of fellows in our universities. So he was not, there was no humility for Shvetaketu. So his father saw this and he said, Shvetaketu, yennu somya idam mahamana anuchanamani stabda yuta tam adesham aprakshya. So he said, what, Shvetaketu, I've sent you for 12 years for studies. What have you come back as? You've come back as a very arrogant person. Let me ask you a question. Yena ashrutam shrutam bhavati, amatam matam bhavati, avijnatam vijnatam iti. So he says, did you study about that? Hearing which means you've heard about everything. Thinking about which means you've thought about everything. Knowing about which means that you've known about everything. So he puts this fundamental question to Shvetaketu, and Shvetaketu is dumbstruck. He cannot answer this question. So that is the background for Tattvamasi, and we should never forget this. The background is, here is a chap, Shvetaketu, who comes back home full of arrogance and ego, assuming that he knows everything, and his dad is asking him a simple question and he is not able to answer. So moving on to the next slide, Chitra. So moving on to the Prakarana contextual relevance, because we can't deal with
Yeah,
the whole
Madhu,
chapters.
Madhu,
Yeah.
just want sorry to interrupt. With the previous slide, I was going to say, like, even in Tamil, we say Savakasam, you know,
Savakasam. Yeah.
Savakasam ukan pese அப்படின்னு. That's the same thing, like Kannada. So,
Yeah, good. Thank you. So when you go to the Prakarana, contextual relevance, and the preamble to Tattvamasi, I wish I spent time to talk about chapter 6. There is so much philosophy in that. There is one big thing called Vacharambana Shruti. Vacharambana Vikaro, Namadeyam, Ritikaitige. So he goes on about talking about, is this cause and effect, or is it about independence and dependence? All that philosophy comes in the initial portions of chapter 6. So you need to be aware of the Prakarana there. So, for example, there is a very key verse there. Sadeva Somya Idamagra Asid Ekameva Advitiyam. And then the Uddalaka Aruni talks about how this creation comes about, how this Trivrut Karana means the mud, the water, and heat, they mix together, and all these material things get shaped. And then how Nama Rupa, every object that is created is given a name, and how the Supreme Brahman links this name to the objects, and how this universe then comes about. And we have dealt with this quite a lot. And then this whole creation thing that Uddalaka talks about basically talks about the supreme majesty of Brahman, and it points out to the fact of how completely dependent we are as finite reality. So he starts off this preamble before he goes to Tattvamasi. Okay, so remember, Shvetaketu, an ego, arrogant person to start with, and then his dad asking him questions and he is not able to answer. And then the dad then starts giving him a philosophy of the greatness of Brahman and how he creates the universe. And then to bring home the message as to how, as finite reality, like all of us as jivas, how we are utterly dependent on the supreme, he gives an example which actually sets the scene for the Tattvamasi. So he says, Uddalako Arunihi Shveteketum Putram Uvacha Swapnantam me Somya Vijanihi iti Yatrai tat Purushaha Swapiti Nama Sata Somya Tada Sampanno Bhavati Swam Apito Bhavati Tasmadenam Swam iti Achakshate Swam hi Apito Bhavati, he says. Uddalaka, these are really profound words of Uddalaka Aruni, basically taking an example of our conscious states and then talking about how we are so dependent in our conscious states. And he picks the most important example. And we have discussed this so many times before about the Sushupti states, that is the state of dreamless sleep. The three states of consciousness that we have discussed: Jagrati Sthana, Swapna Sthana, and Sushupti Sthana. So, wakeful state, dream state, and dreamless sleep. And Uddalaka picks up the dreamless sleep state. Dreamless sleep state where our sense contact with the sense object is not there, mind's contact with the sense organs is not there, mind's contact with the jiva is not there. So we are in a complete unconscious state at that point. If our house is burgled, we would not know that. If somebody puts a knife into our chest, we would not know that. So it is such an utterly dependent state. So Uddalaka Aruni picks that state. Look, man, every night you go through Sushupti. Every night you go to Sushupti state and then you wake up in the morning, and yet you don't realize what a dependent state your existence is. He picks up this very important verse, and in Mandukya Upanishad also we have dealt with this when we dealt with the various states of consciousness, where this particular state of consciousness of Sushupti is controlled by that prajna form of the Supreme. I just wanted to put that one to remind you that we have done that before. So coming back to this, Uddalakaruni is picking up an example, is picking up a daily example talking about a dreamless state. So moving on to the next slide. So now that is where the whole context of Tat Tvam Asi comes in. Okay, so our birds are back. B is Tat, Tvam is Jiva bird, and the B bird is Tat and Asi. Okay, so what is the nature of Brahman? He is Sarvajñatvadi Gunaha. Whereas what is the state of Jiva? He is Agnyata, Cha Alpa Shaktitvam, Dukkitvam, Swalpa Kartruta. This is our four characteristics. As Agnyata, we are always ignorant. We know something, but we still think that we know everything. Actually, we are really ignorant people. Alpa Shaktitvam, as I've said before, I can't even bake a cake before. That is my strength. Dukkitvam, every day we have cycles of dukkha and so-called sukha. So Dukkitvam, Swalpa Kartruta, we can't even bake a cake. Forget about creating the universe. Our capacity to act is very limited. These are our four qualities of Jiva. Whereas the qualities of Brahman is the opposite of that. He is Sarvajñatva, he is Sarvashaktitvam, he is always in infinite bliss, and he is a creator of the universe. Yeah, Sarvakarta. So everything is infinite for him, everything is limited for him, for us. So how are we then going to say Tat and Tvam are the same? How are we going to say this? That is a big question mark that comes here when Uddalaka introduces this concept. So before I go into the verses proper, I wanted to give you this background. So when I say Simmo Devadattaha, it probably means he is brave as a lion. So all the schools of philosophy do not take Tattvamasi in its literal sense. It is a metaphor only for Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Dvaita. Everybody uses this as a metaphor to explain a philosophical concept. Now, I wanted to burst this bubble because there is a misunderstanding out there. Somehow, Tattvamasi is a weapon that stands on its own, and that it can, and then one can build a airy castle around it. That is not the case. The truth of the matter is Tattvamasi is a metaphor for all schools. So then that question comes, what kind of lakshana do we use? What kind of metaphor rules do we use? Do we use Jaha Lakshana? Do we use Ajaha Lakshana? Do we use Ajaha Lakshana? Now you have to use those principles and say you have to use minimum Lakshana to understand the meaning of Tattvamasi. So that is the rules of interpretation. So I will come to that a bit later. Next slide, Chitra. And also applications of grammar. Yeah, let us not forget, of course, Paninian grammar is more common these days, but still the Paninian grammar has been adopted from Vedic grammar. So you have Vyakarana and stuff like that, but there are also Vyasa Niruktam, Vyasa Vyakaranam. There are older Vyakaranams also. They also apply applications of grammar. So what are the applications of grammar? So if you look at nouns, yeah, so let us not spend too much time on the grammar aspect of it, because I know some of you are doing Sanskrit classes and you will be dealing with these noun cases. What are the various noun cases? So in most languages it is the same. There are 7 to 8 depending on the language that you look at. So nominative case, vocative case, accusative case, instrumental case, dative case, ablative case, genitive case, and locative case. So those are some of the noun cases that come in languages, and believe me, all other languages have actually adopted the rules of grammar that is there in Sanskrit, and that is why Sanskrit is a mother of all languages. The noun cases are these. Tat is a noun. So what you have to do there is, if you have to understand Tat, you have to use those vibhaktis, as we call it. These are called vibhaktis. So when I say Tat, Tat can mean 7 different things, to be honest. So it can mean Tat Adina. Adina means dependence. Tat Sadrishya. Sadrishya means resemblance. You can say Tat as Tasmin. Tasmin means inside him. Tasmat means because of him. Tasmai means for him. Tasya means you belong to him. Tat Prati means you are alive because of him. Twamasi. So you can bring all these rules of grammar when you look at Tat. So instead of making it complicated, my aim here is to show you how interesting and how expansive this very word becomes. When I say Tat, I have to think about 7 different vibhaktis of Tat and place them next to each other to get different meanings of Tattvamasi, not just you or that. Okay. Look at Sandhi. Sandhi, many of you will be familiar with what Sandhi is. There are 3 types of Sandhis in Sanskrit. The Swara Sandhi, Vyanjana Sandhi, and Visarga Sandhi. So Swara Sandhi is interesting. So there is one particular Swara Sandhi called Suvarna Vara Sandhi, Swarana Sandhi, Swarana Dirgha Sandhi. What that means is if you have vowels, if you have a long vowel at the end of a word and a small vowel at the beginning of another word, and if you want to join both, then you take the dirgha, the long vowel becomes there. So that is also interesting because when I say Sa Atma Tattvamasi, that is a Swarana Dirgha Sandhi. So you can split it open into various ways. You can say Atma Tattvamasi or Atma Atatvamasi. So that way also you can split it. And there is no grammatical objections to that. That is perfectly a reasonable Swarana Dirgha Sandhi to do. So again, it opens up that word Tattvamasi. Now I have shown in this slide, you can now infer how many ways in which I can interpret this Tattvamasi. Atatvamasi is very novel. Atatvamasi means you are not that. Okay, you can even say you are. So many things I describe about God. You are not that made is what it means. That is one way of looking at it. Or you can say Tattvamasi by using the vibhaktis and then employing the language of Lakshana to understand the meanings. Yeah. So I hope it is interesting. So moving on to the next slide. So now we are armed with all this background. So we spoke about Prakarana, we spoke about grammar, we spoke about the preamble, how the Shvetaketu came. Now we have to approach the examples. So the Shvetaketu, what Uddalaka does is initially he has given that example of Sushupti state and how in the Sushupti state we are all very dependent. Now to illustrate this point, he gives an example. He gives a metaphor, a normal common things that we see in this world. The verses are very beautiful, worth reciting it. Sayata Sakuni Shutrena Prabaddo Disham Disham Patitva Anyatra Ayatanam Alabdva Bandhanameva Upashrayate Evameva Kalu Somya Tan Mano Disham Disham Patitva Anyatra Ayatanam Alabdva Pranameva Upashrayate Pranabandhanam Hi Eva Mana Iti. Wonderful statement from Uddalaka. So he takes an example of a bird that the feet of this bird is tied with a string to a small post. We see this in all the cages, and if you go to some zoos and other places, you might see this. So they're tied there. What does this bird do during the daytime? It flies everywhere, saying that it is very independent. It's flying all over the place, and then eventually it is tired because its flight is controlled by the string that is attached to this pillar. It flies all over the place, and when it is tired, it comes and rests and sleeps next to the pillar. Okay, so our man is saying such is the state of the jiva. Pillar is Brahman, this bird is jiva. The jiva goes around everywhere, tired. At the end of the day, it comes and rests with Brahman in the sushupti state, in a very dependent state. That is the position of jivas, is what Uddalaka says with this example. And as soon as he says Saya Esha, and I put it in the red box. That is the key verse. Saya Esha Anima Yetadatmyam Idam Sarvam Tat Satyam Sa Atma Tattvamasi Shvetaketu. Okay, so look at this. This Tattvamasi is sandwiched between so many other words. Are we going to ignore those words? Are we going to ignore the philosophy of the words and not understand the great Vedic philosophy that is there? Are we just going to pluck it and place it aside and come up with an airy-fairy philosophy? Let's look at what it means. Look at what Saha means, what Yaha means, Yesha means. Every word has a meaning. Saha, so Saya Esha Anima. Saha means Saratvat Saha. Saratvat means he is the essence of all. Yaha means Niyamakatvat Yaha. He is the controller of heart. Eshaha means Icha Rupatvat. He can do whatever you want, whatever Icha he can do. Anima means very subtle. He can be known through subtle knowledge. Aitad Atmiya means he is a regulator. He is a lord of all. Idam Sarva means of all these. So you've got 6 words that describes the Supreme's qualities. Then it says Tat Satyam. Tat means Tatatvat Tat. Tatatvat means he is of infinite bliss. Satyam, we have done the meanings of Satyam. He creates 8-fold dispensations of the universe. He creates this universe. You want to scroll down a little bit, Chitra, you can see the lower end of the slide. Saha means Vishnu. Atma means all pervasive infinite attributes. Atatatvacha matratva. Each word there is etymological. So our Rishi has put so many qualities of Brahman there. And then he says Tattvamasi. Okay, so what that would mean, Tattvamasi, there is this Brahman is so big. Tattvamasi means Simho Devadattaha. When I say Simho Devadattaha, you are like that lion, you are like that Brahman, means that you have some of those qualities like him. Like how Simho Devadattaha means you are brave as a lion, but you are not literally a lion. Similarly, when I say Tattvamasi, look at this great guy. You have certain aspects of him. That is what this verse is saying in the very first verse. Moving on to the next one, Chitra, next slide. Now the philosophers then each example in this leads on to the next example. It is not talking about the same, rattling about the same Tattvamasi 9 times. It actually brings 9 different concepts at least for us to understand our relationship between the Supreme. Now he takes the example of honey. Ajit was mentioning about honey. So I don't want to go into the verse because we may be running out of time. So what does that verse basically says? He says this madhu. So yata somya madhu kruto. So madhu kruto means bees. The bees go to different flowers. They collect the nectar and they come to the beehive and they deposit the nectar there. So this various bees bring nectar and put it there, and that composite mixture is what we call honey. So the Rishi is saying, look at that honey. Each portion in that honey comes from a particular flower. But does that portion of the nectar know that it is coming from this flower? Does another portion of the nectar know that it is coming from another flower? No, they don't. So I've underlined that. It says, Tatra na vivekam labante. They do not know that they come from this flower. That is our state. We actually do not know that we have actually come from the Supreme. In creation, we spoke about how we are all in his womb and we come out and then we go in. Similarly is our situation. We have actually come from him. But you know what? We have forgotten about this. Ignorance of our origin and relationship with the Supreme is being shown here. In the example 3, so honey is an insentient thing. But what about Abhimani Devatas of river, which are sentient beings? That is this concept of Abhimani Devatas. In India, Ganges, Godavari, Kaveri, they are all goddesses and we go and worship those. So there is also, he takes up this example. All the rivers eventually go to the sea. And each component of the river is in the sea. The sea is the sea, but the rivers go and join the sea. Does each river know that there is another river next to me? No, they don't. They are not aware of that. Similarly, we do not know that there is there is another sentient being that is next to us. His name is Brahman. Do we know him? No, we don't know him. That is our ignorance of our origin relationship of Supreme. That is the third example he gives. Moving on to the next slide, Chitra. So in the fourth example, before going into this fourth example, he gives an example. He says here, Ta iha vyagrova, simhova, vrukova, varahova, kitova, patangova, damshova, mashakova, yed bhavanti, tada bhavanti. Because we have forgotten our origin, because we have forgotten that we have come from the Supreme, and because of our ignorance, what is happening? We are going through these various species of life. Vyagra means tiger, Simha we know is lion, Vruko means wolf, Varaha means the wild boar, Patango means the worm, the Damsho means the fly, Mashako means the mosquito. That is also another type. Damsho means house fly. Mashako means another type of insect. And then Mashako is mosquito, as I said. Yeah. So all these, we go through this life, we go through these various forms of life because we have forgotten we have come from this origin. We have come from this Brahman. That is what that example is telling us. Moving on to the next slide. So if you go to the next slide, fourth verse, he takes an example of a tree, and he says, if you cut one of the branch of the tree, it will ooze a juice and it will still be alive. If you cut another branch in the tree, it will still be alive. If you cut the trunk of the tree, it is still alive, because that God who is there in the tree and the jiva is there in the tree, and inside the jiva, the God is there in the tree. As long as God is there, the jiva is there and the tree is alive. The moment God leaves, Jiva leaves, and the tree becomes dry and it dies. Yeah, that is the literal meaning. I mean, I don't have time to go into each word of this, but that is the gist of it. Again, to bring home the message that the Supreme is the sustainer of us. Our life, what we do every day, He is the sustainer. We are the beings We somehow think we are doing everything. He is the sustainer. Now, to bring home the truth again, that the Supreme is even the source of our bodies and our creation, he takes this beautiful example of a Nyagroda tree. Nyagroda phalam ata ahareti. Idam bhagavaiti, binditi, binna bhagavaiti, kimmatra pashyati, anva iveme danaha bhagavaiti. Angayam ekakam binditi, binna bhagavaiti, kimmatra pashyati, na kinchana bhagavaiti. So what does that mean? He says, the father says, go and get a fruit from the Nyagroda tree, that is a banyan tree. So he brings the fruit. Then he says, open this fruit. And then he says, he opens the fruit and says, what do you see? He says, I see a lot of seeds. Then he says, take one seed and break it open. Then he says, what do you see? The son says, I can't see anything. You know what? You can't see something. It is that something that is inside that seed that has actually made this big banyan tree. Who is that thing that is there inside that seed that makes it the banyan tree? You could say it's the DNA, but what makes the DNA work in that way? What is it that is that efficient cause that makes the DNA to work that way? That is the question that Uddalaka asks. So in this example, the banyan tree is the universe, the fruit are the individual bodies, and the seed is the jiva. And inside the jiva is this Brahman, who is the source of everything else. So by giving this beautiful example, the Rishi is bringing home the message as to what our position is. So moving on to the next slide. Then the son has got a doubt. He says, you are saying inside that seed there is this entity, and then that because of that entity that is there, this whole tree is born, but I can't see him. How do I know he is there? He says, this is another beautiful passage. Basically, he says, okay, fine, go and get a glass of water. So he brings, fill it with water. So he fills it in. Then he says, put some salt in it. He throws some salt in it, and he says, keep it overnight. So he keeps it overnight. Then he says, next day morning, bring that glass of water. So he brings the glass of water. Then he says, can you show me where the salt is here? So the son will say, no, salt, I can't see any salt here. So the father will say, okay, fine, take a spoon, take a bit of water from the top end and sip it. And he sips it. Then he says, what do you taste? He says, I taste salt. Then he says, take the bottom portion, sip it. What do you see? He says, I taste salt. Take from the middle portion. What do you taste? He says, salt. Similarly, my dear son, this supreme being is all pervasive and he is very subtle. You can't see him, but you should be able to experience him. Is this great philosophy that Uddalaka gives with the sixth example. And then he moves to the seventh example because the son is still confused. You're saying all these things, but how do I know? How do I know that who is going to teach me? How do I know that the subtle being is there? So then the seventh most important example talks about how the presence of a guru becomes indispensable for this transaction. And he gives an example of how a man who is blindfolded, he's left in the Gandhara place. A man from Gandhara is blindfolded, taken into a forest, and he is left there. Now he has to make his way back to Gandhara. How is he going to do this? He initially panics, but then he, along the way, asks various people for direction. How do I go to Gandhara? And eventually, various people along his journey give him the direction, and eventually he reaches Gandhara. So Uddala Karuni says, similarly, my dear son, you need to find a teacher. You need to find a guru who will give you the direction to understand that subtle thing called the Brahman. And then he will again, every time this verse is said, the Rishi will say, Saya Esha Anima Aitadatmyam Idam Sarvam Tat Satyam Sa Atma Tattvam Asi Shvetaketu. Every example is followed by this particular verse that describes the greatness of the Supreme Being. Moving on to the next slide. So the next slide then goes to example 8 and 9. So this is very important. So the example 8 talks about a sick man. Then the Uddalaka says, let's take an example of a sick man. He is on the sick bed, he is on the deathbed, he is on the sick man, and all his relatives are sitting next to him. So they all ask, the relatives all ask the man, can you see me? Can you hear me talking, Mr. X? You're so unwell. Can you see me? This is your cousin who is here. Can you see me? Can you hear me talking? So the Uddalaka says, as long as the Indriyas have not merged in the mind, And as long as the mind is not merged in the prana, and as long as the prana is not merged in Parasyam Devatayam, as it's called, as long as that has not happened, the sick man will say, yes, I can recognize you, thanks for coming. But the moment the merging happens, and finally that Parasyam Devatam decides, I'm going to leave this body, this fellow is finished. Okay. And as many of us are physicians here, and when we see that in our daily lives, it should bring home this message as how utterly helpless we are at that point of death, or when we are in that ultimate sickness state, how utterly helpless we are. Yet throughout our life of 70, 80, or whatever years that we are going to be here, we somehow assume that we are in total control with ourselves. That is utter stupidity of how we run our transaction of life. And Uddalaka is bringing home that message to us. And putting that sick man is very significant here. Why should you put a sick man, not a very fit man? Because to bring home the message of utter helplessness. There is a very sarcastic joke that is there in the philosophical circles. It's called Shivo Aham Bhava Der Boge Roge Mrutyunjana Archakaha, which means when I am very fit and well and I have eaten my food and I'm very happy, I will go jump, say, Shivo Aham, I am Shiva, I am Shiva, I will jump. But when I have become sick and I've got disease, I'll go and do a Mrutyunjana Homa at home. I'll do a Mrutyunjana Archaka. I'll pray to the same Shiva to actually to help me. Such is our state. When we are fit, we think we are God. And when we are in our utter helplessness, we just go and search for his somebody to protect us. So that putting that sick man example is again to bring home that message as to how utterly helpless we are. Yes, when we are in the deathbed, can somebody here tell me in that deathbed, anybody is going to say Aham Brahmasmi and Tat Tvam Asi and go on? I'm sorry to say, even Shankaracharya's mother did not agree to that. And in her deathbed, when Shankaracharya appeared and he asked his mother to say Aham Brahmasmi, the history there is his mother refused to say that, and then he asks her to pray to Narayana. So that is the history behind that, of things that many people don't realize, how utterly helpless we are in that state. Look at the ninth example. This is a ninth example where again the Tattvamasi comes. Now here, this is an example of a thief. So they say, the story is, the thief is tied because he has stolen something and he is brought to the court. In the court, the judge says, okay, if this fellow is really a thief and he has actually stolen something, let us give him an axe, that is red hot axe. If he is telling the truth, the axe will not burn him. But if he is telling untruth, the axe will burn him. Is the story behind, is the dialogue in this particular example. Now you should ask yourself the example, why is Uddala Karuni giving an example of a thief? That is extremely important about the metaphor of a thief to illustrate a philosophy. Why is he giving a thief? Who is a thief? A thief is a person who steals things that belongs to others. This universe belongs to whom? This universe belongs to the Supreme Being. Ishavasya says, Ishavasyam idam sarvam. Yeah, tat Ishavasyam idam sarvam yatkincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bunjita magridaha kasya siddhanam. So that is that verse. Ishavasyam idam sarvam. This whole universe belongs to him. He is the owner of everything. But what have we done? We have actually stolen everything. So that person who steals from Brahman, what has he stolen from Brahman? He has stolen the concept of independence from Brahman. We all know that we are utterly dependent, but somehow we have assumed independence. And a person who steals the independence, which is a primary field of the Supreme Being, he alone is independent. Yeah. Uh, all else are dependent, but the one who steals that and assumes himself to be independent is the real thief. And that is the reason why the thief example is given. If, for example, a person who is ignorant of Brahmatma Aikya, if somebody is ignorant of that, we can only call them as an idiot or a fool, but not as a thief. Thief means he has stolen something, and that example there becomes very, very important. And this is a difficult knot that some schools cannot get away from, as to why there is an example of a thief, why there is an example of a sick man. So I hope that Uddalaka Aruni, by actually giving these 9 examples, asking us to do the samanvaya there and understand what the deep philosophy is, rather than scrape the surface and come up with an airy-fairy philosophy. So moving on to the next slide. So what is the internal evidence within the Vedas? Go to Parama Upanishad. You don't need to go anywhere. Parama Upanishad, which is one of the parts of the Veda, talks about this Tat Tvam Asi in great detail. And it says, Yata Pakshi cha Sutram cha Nana Vriksha Rasayata, Yata Nadyaha Samudrascha, Shuddho Lavano Yata, Yata Chora Apaharyo cha Yata Pumsi Vishayapi, Tata Jiva Ishwara Binnau. सर्वदैव विलक्षणौ तथा अपि सूक्ष्म रूपत्वान् न जीवात् परमो हरिः भेदेन बन्ध दृश्यते प्रेरको अपि सन् वैलक्षण्यं तयोर्ज्ञात्वा मुच्यते बध्यते अन्यथा. Clear statement from Upanishads in the Upanishads itself. And I sometimes wonder, how can our friends in the Advaita school ignore all this? Look at the bird on the road, nectar and the different flowers, river and the sea, salt and water, thief and stolen goods, blinded person and the Gandhara, tree and different branches, Nyagroda tree and the seed, sick person and the relative. Parama Upanishad says these are all pairs that are always different. Similarly, Jiva and Brahman are always different, but the Tattvamasi is metaphor to say you are different, but you are like him because you are also Satchitananda Swarupa. He is also Satchitananda Swarupa. His Satchitananda Swarupa is infinite, but yours is finite and limited. So in that sense, you are like him is the philosophy there. So moving on to the tail end of this presentation. Next slide, Chitra. So it brings home this concept. We have discussed this before about Bimba Pratibimba Bhava, which is the foundation of the Rigvedic philosophy, which says Rupam Rupam Pratirupo Babuvaha Tadasya Rupam Pratichakshanaya Indro Mayabihi Purarupayeyate Yuktahi Yasya Harayaha Shatadasha. He says inside every jiva is this Brahman who controls this jiva. Yeah, each jiva, there are infinite jivas, so are the infinite forms of the Lord inside each jiva and controls it. And I've given that example of Bimba and Pratibimba with an object and a reflection, and we have discussed this several times. So if you look at the Tat, the Vibhakti forms of Tat, various examples of Tat actually illustrate this Bimba Pratibimba relationship, that is the dependence of the jiva to the supreme being, is what that the vibhaktis of Tat actually, it is dependence, resemblance, inside him, because of him, for him, belong to him, you are alive because of him, all applies to the pratibimba or the reflection in that example. And of course, the great birds are back again. And from Mundaka Upanishad, we know about the Dvasuparana quite a lot. And what is the second verse is? Jushtam yada pashyati anyamisham asya mahimanam iti vita shokaha. The solace and the liberation of the jiva is when it turns back and then realizes that it is different from this Brahman and it is dependent on this Brahman. That is when there is scope for its liberation. Clear words of Mundaka Upanishad that nobody can refute. And of course, Madhva in his Anuvyakhana would summarize and say, wherever there is these kind of, texts that seem to indicate the Jiva Brahma Aikya, you need to use the rules of Tatparya Lingas, the Purva Mimamsa sutras, grammar and everything, and understand it properly. Don't jump with some airy-fairy philosophy. The philosophy of the Vedas is much more deeper. So, and he would say, Swatantriyesha Vishishtatve Sthana Matya Aikyaropi Sadrishecha Aikyavat Samyak Savakasha Eteshtataha. So, all the things that I've said so far will fit into this of resemblance, of this independent controlling the dependent, of being in the same place or having similar views. They're all the ways of interpreting these Aikya Shrutis, which are Savakasha Shrutis. And how do you do Samanvaya of that is how I've described you in the last 15 to 20 slides. So HinduKnowledgeAcademy.com will celebrate Vedic culture and present its philosophies to the modern Hindu in an accessible format. Our ancient heritage is our greatest strength. Through preservation and dissemination, together let us spread positivity in the world. Thank you for listening and welcome to Hindu Knowledge Academy.